afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be able to join you all in DC for what I know will be a fascinating address by Dr. Ramani. I would like to thank the Chair and the Steering Committee of DSAI for the invitation and the opportunity to say a few words. The Irish Government recognises the invaluable contribution that research and learning makes to the effectiveness of our development aid programme. And in a better world, we remain committed to this contribution, and DSA serves as a model for this collaboration in practice. I'm Deputy Director of Policy Unit within Irish Aid, leading on governance, democracy and human rights, and my work does include the topic of disinformation. I recently returned from New York, where I was Sanctions Coordinator and Legal Advisor for Ireland's mission to the UN during our Security Council term. And as former sanctions coordinator, I can attest from experience that today's topic is indeed very timely. And we've witnessed firsthand in recent years the threat posed by disinformation on the global stage. We are operating in a context of profound instability, disruption, and uncertainty. And we've seen how the spread of false narratives and targeted disinformation has eroded confidence in medical evidence and expertise, undermined democratic norms, and sowed mistrust between people and their governments. These and other effects of disinformation can be particularly destabilizing and damaging in developing contexts and fragile and conflict-affected states. And as a department, we are reflecting on this topic in more depth and in the context of development and technology. And we have seen how technology can act as a positive tool for development and humanitarian work, but there are, however, very live secondary impacts and concerns, which includes the topic of misinformation and disinformation and related threats to democracy. We need to examine how we can leverage new and emerging technologies to counter false narratives, to explain how we build in systems and safeguards for these technologies without limiting freedom of expression. And on research, we are working on research to reflect on the channels and methods of disinformation and its impacts. And very importantly, we need public discussion on this topic. And for that, I would like to recognise the DSAI for including this theme in the annual conference. And I would like to thank Dr. Ramani for his joining us today, and I look forward to his expertise and insight. Thank you very much.
Okay, and thank you so much, Siobhan, for your remarks and for the invitation to be here as a keynote. It's really an honor to be speaking here, and it's great to be back in Dublin. So today I'm going to be discussing, as the title of the presentation shows, Russia's weaponization of narratives inside Africa and how that fits in with the broader contours of Russia's disinformation strategy across the globe. I'll begin by trying to provide a new context and a reconceptualization of the concept of Russian disinformation and the tools and tactics that Russia employs, and then delve a bit deeper into how Russia applied those tactics to Africa, using a few case studies, and also illustrating what may be some of the future trends and things that we should be paying attention to when it comes to Russian information warfare. So, first of all, I called Russia a disinformation state in the title, and that's because disinformation plays an absolutely integral role in Russian security policy. It's something more than just a tool and a tactic. For Russian elites and for the Putin regime, disinformation is also being used as a tool of self-preservation. And that's something that I'm going to be discussing as it goes on. But to begin, I just wanted to provide a brief overview of what Russian disinformation is and what kind of threats does it pose. So basically, the modern disinformation tactics that Russia is using are not necessarily new. Russia's been using basically the same kind of tactics since the beginning of the Soviet Union, since the early 1920s, when they started developing active measures. In 1923, of course, under the influence of Stalin, there was the creation of the Information Bureau that was dealing precisely with these purposes. Obviously, the techniques have gotten more modernized, obviously, as we moved from radio broadcasts to social media, but the importance of disinformation as a tool of Russian foreign and security policy is something that has been a relatively consistent feature of what Russia's been doing for about 100 years, maybe with a slight dip that would have occurred in the Gorbachev era and in the Yeltsin era, when Russia was trying to ingratiate itself a bit with the West and was trying to establish a bit more of a pluralistic internal political structure. Russian disinformation has consistently, throughout these past 100 years, served three purposes. I list them over here: propaganda, subversion, polarization. Propaganda was basically trying to showcase the superiority of the Soviet system and of Marxist-Leninism during the Cold War, and more recently trying to burnish and create a more favorable impression of Russia in the world, trying to heal the dearth of alliances that they have and to bolster their soft power. Subversion is basically referring to the strategy that Russia uses to create divisions and to sow discord, particularly inside Western democracies, but also increasingly inside the global South. And does that through the recruitment of agents, through political interference campaigns, the use of political technologists, and more recently, techniques like troll farms, bot farms, and other forms of social media campaigns that are aimed at engineering public opinion in their preferred direction. In addition, Russia's also been trying to polarize cleavages between secularism and Islam, particularly in the MENA region, and also between various different ethnicities in Africa to try to effectively gain influences by fomenting wedge issues and pitting old rivals against each other. And the third is polarization. The Russians have consistently used disinformation as a tool to polarize and bifurcate and sharpen the international system. So whether that be during the early stages of the Cold War, ensuring that nascent newly colonized countries turn towards the Soviet model, emphasizing their Soviet support for decolonization and away from what the West would be offering them, effectively ensuring that the third world was more divided and more polarized. And now in the contemporary context, it is about dividing the global North and the global South. So ensuring that even though the developed world and the US and Europe are sanctioning Russia for its involvement in Ukraine, they don't want, obviously, Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and Asia to follow suit. So they've been aimed at using disinformation for these purposes, right? Propaganda of the Soviet and Russian systems, subversion to create division, and polarization to ensure that Russia is not isolated, and to ensure that Russia maintains a network of partners. And the relative importance of these goals has fluctuated over the course of time, but all three have always been active. So what we're seeing with Russia in the Ukraine war today, where they spread outlandish falsehoods about how Russia is liberating Ukrainians, or how they're trying to give free rein to African countries, while they're also trying to embolden far left and far right populist movements in the West, and dividing the international system and the United Nations increasingly between a global South bloc that, if not supportive of it, is acquiescent to their actions or will punish their actions, and global North bloc that's a golden billion that's critical of them, is all something that they've been honing and working on for many, many decades. And these have always occurred in tandem. So I basically talked about most of these things just in the previous two slides that I was just talking. But this is a brief history of Russian disinformation, and maybe this will just be useful to kind of conceptualize everything. Obviously, it dates back, as I said, to 1923. And I would say, just flashing forward to the Putin era dimension, I think from 2000 to 2008, the focus of Russian disinformation was largely on the propaganda dimension. It was about stemmed from the belief, obviously, that Russia was somewhat misunderstood after the end of the Cold War. Russia was seen as a power that was becoming increasingly irrelevant to the global stage, effectively a superpower that had fallen down to being a regional power with nuclear weapons and energy. And Putin wanted to use propaganda to create a different image of Russia, one of a resurgent great power, and one of a country that can project influence and power across the world. So and also Putin wanted to promote the Russian model of governance and the Russian economic performance at the time as something positive, as something that was somewhat aligned with the state-centric authoritarian model offered by China, but distinct from it, still with having some democratic characteristics. So it was called sovereign democracy, effectively, right? And in 2005, that's when we saw the creation of RT. It was aimed at kind of reconceptualizing people's views of Russia, trying to show that Russia was not the Soviet Union. Russia was playing an active role on the world stage, and Russia was pursuing a course of development that was different from the West, but also different from China, and it was kind of a potential leader of a third way. So that was kind of what was dominant in 2000, 2008. The turning point, however, came in 2008 when the Russians began embarking on their course of military interventions that we have seen culminate in the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And that was when the Russians intervened in Georgia in August of 2008 against Saakashvili's government and tried to establish permanent states in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which they recognized later on. And that was where we started seeing a lot more use of information warfare that was based on recruiting surrogates in the West to be able to parrot off their agenda. So the subversion dimension came in, and also trying to polarize international opinion around Russia's actions in Georgia. And that's the same thing that we've seen occur in other crises like Crimea, Syria, and now most recently with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, the propaganda dimension has continued, whereas Russia tries to burnish itself as a humanitarian aid donor. It tries to sometimes showcase itself as a country that is involved in combating the effects of Western unilateralism and Western sanctions. But the subversion and polarization dimensions that I think have become even more important. And we see that with the change in the way the Russian state media networks work. Whereas RT and Sputnik in the early stages, especially RT, were focused on burnishing a positive image of Russia in the world and trying to correct misunderstandings about Russia. Now it's about emboldening the political extremes and the political fringes inside the West to sow division and to sow mistrust across the aisle, and also trying to sow division directly between the global South and the global North. So that's why I'm saying that even though all three dimensions have always existed, the subversion and the polarization dimensions have become more important over the past 15 years than just the pure propaganda dimension. So what are the objectives of Russian disinformation inside Putin's Russia, now that we've discovered and explained what it encompasses? Typically, we view information warfare and disinformation as a largely offensive tool. And that comes out of our understanding of Russian hybrid warfare doctrine, which would combine disinformation, diplomacy, the use of hard military force, the mobilization of proxies and surrogates, and various forms of economic coercion, whether it be energy and now increasingly food, all together in some kind of amalgam. And probably in a bit of a misinterpretation of Valery Gerasimov's exact ideological view, that's been often called the Gerasimov doctrine, or the doctrine of hybrid warfare. So that's generally how Russian disinformation is viewed. I also think that we should not just look at Russian disinformation as a purely offensive tool. We should notice that it's also used as a defensive tool by the Putin regime. Self-preservation may be even more important than the offensive impacts of disinformation. And when I'm talking about self-preservation, I'm talking about the preservation of the Putin regime against potential threats internally to it from those who oppose their policies, and also self-preservation in the context of preventing Russia from becoming a complete pariah state and becoming completely isolated from the international community. They're okay, and they're managing the fact that the West is isolating them, but they want to sow divisions even there, and they don't want the rest of the world to isolate Russia. So basically, it's about preserving Putin's regime at home and preventing Russia from becoming like North Korea or Iran, increasingly, on the sidelines of international diplomacy and the international economy. And there's and the aim in which Russia tries to shield the regime at home is by creating a feedback loop. I'm just going to explain what I mean by that over here. For example, there are a lot of inside Russia, there's a deep mistrust of political institutions. And that dates back to the Soviet era and also the chaos of the 1990s. When we look at public opinion surveys inside Russia, repeatedly we only see high levels of trust in the presidency and to some extent the Russian armed forces. So that's been deteriorating with the current war, and very low levels of support for most other senior cabinet ministers, even the prime minister, and also the judiciary and various other institutions inside Russia. So Russia's political system has always been marred by systematic mistrust of what they've heard coming out of the officials, and probably rightfully so, given the history of manipulating public opinion and promoting outrageous falsehoods that we see from the top. The president has generally been held in slightly higher esteem than the rest, but the system itself is viewed with a lot of mistrust and as corrupt and as often working against the interests of society. So Russia uses this information abroad to find like-minded voices that will reiterate and repeat their narratives and their alternative reality. So if you have people in Africa, if you have people in Europe from certain far left or far right parties saying something, people in totally disparate parts of the world saying the same thing, there must be a grain of truth in this, and maybe you should trust it, maybe you should listen to what we're saying. And even if they can't convince people to trust the government, they convince people to stay passive and they convince people not to take up unrest and to oppose the government. So that's the important thing that when I talk about the feedback loop that's there. The second thing, obviously, is the promotion of Russia's governance model at home, and trying to ignore the fact that over the course of the past 15 years, you've seen a marked decline in Russian economic growth since the energy boom of the early 2000s faded away, and basically a lot of situations with regards to controversial pension reforms, problems with the healthcare system, problems with urban development. And so how does Russia cover that up? Not necessarily by being able to improve the conditions of the middle class and improve the conditions of the next generation, but because economic diversification and large-scale reform is risky for the survival of the elites there. But they can do that by saying, if you think the situation that we have is bad, that the liberal order is not all that it's cracked up to be, and liberal Western countries suffer from similar kinds of problems. So that's why they tend to exaggerate and also promote and draw a lot of attention to inequality, racial unrest, homelessness, a lot of social dysfunctions inside the West, saying that if you're dissatisfied with our system, liberalism is not much better. It may even be in some cases worse, and that creates a feedback loop when they find some carefully curated voices to repeat those narratives and to bring that back home too. So that's another reason how Russian disinformation is not it's aimed at dividing Western societies, also is aimed at strengthening Putin's regime at home. And finally, is obviously ensuring that the international system does not isolate Russia. It's just the West against Russia, and the rest is on its side, or the rest is at least not punishing it. So now I've explained how Russian disinformation is not just a tool of hybrid warfare. It's not just an offensive tool. In fact, its offensive capacity, as you'll see in Africa, has actually been much less effective in a lot of cases than its ability to divide the international system and to keep Putin in power. I just want to give you an overview of some of the tactics that Russia is using today. You've obviously got state media networks, headlined by RT and Sputnik, but also up until June of this year, Prigozhin's networks that included the Federal News Agency, and it's unclear what's exactly going to happen to them now that he's dead. There's the political technologists, obviously. Russia has created NGOs to kind of promote its agenda across the world, including the Foundation for National Values, for example, which promotes conservative values, the ideas of a Russian conservatism, even in countries like Mali. And a variety of lone wolf operatives and social media campaigns that they use. Many of those also were linked to Prigozhin, so the exact nature and makeup and personalities who will carry them forward are unclear, but they're still an important part of Russia's information arsenal. The third is the recruitment of Russian surrogates and proxies across the globe to basically create that feedback loop. That's usually people in the political extremes inside the West, as well as creating pro-Russian civil society inside some various global South countries, mainly amongst people who are opposed to Western security policy, Western counterterrorism policy, Western sanctions, and trying to rally those people around. Like we've seen that recently, for example, with Niger, where they rallied critics of the French counterterrorism policy and supported organizations like M62. So the organization that wanted to keep the European diplomats hostage until the French troops left. That organization also was carrying Russian flags about a year and a half ago. So they're quite close with the Russians in that respect. The fourth, obviously, is local media penetration. And one of the things that Russia has an advantage in is its first mover advantage, its speed, its agility. It's able to get its narratives out quite quickly into new international media outlets. For example, in Africa, they wrote many stories about that basically would frame Ukraine and the West for the crisis in terms of food. Ukraine mining its ports against the potential amphibious landing in Odessa was seen as Ukraine trying to weaponize the Ukrainian Nazi regime, trying to weaponize food against the global South. The Western sanctions were blamed as the cause, and the problem is Ukrainian and Western diplomats took months to reply sometimes to those counterweights, if at all, and Russian op-eds were running in these newspapers from their ambassadors and their diplomats, and Russia got an informational advantage simply because it moved quickly. So these are the four major tools: state media, political technologists, local proxies, and local media penetration. And we're seeing that even extending into the European Union. For example, local narratives about Donbass separatism and about how Russia is rescuing the people in the East have been quite prolific in countries like Hungary, countries like Bulgaria, which might explain some of their the deviant kind of back and forth policies on supporting the Ukrainian cause and actually outright condemning Russia's violations of sovereignty. Russia has effectively created a disinformation nexus as well between these different organs and the state. So basically, these political technologists and the state media promote something and they test out different theories. And then we see Russian officials kind of pick 2 or 3 of the theories that seem to be gaining the most traction. And the Russian foreign minister might say something, the Russian defense minister might say something else, Putin might say something similar that blends the two. And therefore, you have a nexus that's created. And that interplay between using political technologists and state media outlets effectively as laboratory experiments, like kind of putting out different ideas, seeing which ideas fit, and the Kremlin picking a few of them and kind of popularizing them is something that we see in many different contexts. So now turning towards Africa. Russian disinformation in Africa is not primarily reliant on promoting Russia as a country inside Africa. I mean, there are obviously some exceptions to this. I mean, they showcase some of the new educational programs that Russia developed. For example, Rosatom, the Nuclear Energy Agency, and their scholarships for African students, the tripling of students from Ethiopia, for example, to Russia, which was announced at the July 2023 summit in St. Petersburg. Also, they sometimes showcase humanitarian aid displays. For example, Russia just providing aid to Darfur in 2007 gained a lot of coverage as an early example. Even though Russia was selling 80% of the weapons that overall Bashir's regime and the Janjaweed were actually using to make the civilian populations there that suffer severe casualties and destroying their quality of life. And also an emphasis on a values-based partnership based on shared ideas about conservatism and the broader rejection of the US-led liberal order. So those are obviously some examples and some exceptions of where Russia is trying to promote itself as a country. But for the most part, Russian disinformation in Africa is aimed at preventing Africa from isolating Russia, preventing Africa from turning its back on Russia, and preventing African leaders in civil society from really standing up to Russia's enabling of kleptocracy, authoritarianism, weaponization of food against African countries in the global south, and also the countervailing pressure from the West to decouple and detach themselves. So it's aimed at promoting passivity about their international actions, making people view the situation in Ukraine as something that's far away, the war crimes that are happening there as not our fight, not our struggle, even though obviously the supply chain disruptions and some of the other things that have happened as a result of Ukraine directly impact the lives of people in Africa, and encouraging African countries to consider Russia as a potential partner. So not isolating it, not sanctioning it. When you look at the efficacy of Russian disinformation in Africa, we see some interesting trends. We see that Russian information warfare and the expansion of Russian RT and Sputnik's presence across the continent, including the movement of RT and Sputnik operatives who are working in Europe to new bureaus, for example, the one that was created in South Africa, or the expansion of Sputnik's Francophone networks, which started in Tunisia and now are moving across many of the French colonies in West Africa, have really had negligible positive impact on African public perceptions of Russia or Putin's leadership. When you look at the year after year surveys that come from the Pew Research Center, which talks about global research and global leadership assessments, coming from Gallup, coming from various other, the Democratic Initiative Foundation is another one that would probably be more pro-Ukraine, but it's still coming out with it. What you see is that there are 30 to 40% of people in most African countries have an approval of Putin's leadership. It doesn't really vary that much across regional powers. You see similar statistics in Kenya or South Africa or even Nigeria or Egypt, regardless of what their position on the war is. They're all coming over there. And that's significantly behind what we're seeing in China and the United States, which averages about 60 or 70%. Moreover, we see large majorities of people in most African countries, with the exception of Mali, which was polled by The Economist last year, which showed a plurality of people in support of the invasion of Ukraine, and to some extent Cote d'Ivoire, which also had an experience with French intervention in 2011. Majority of peoples are opposing the Russian war in Ukraine and the Russian aggression. But the majority of people also in those very same countries that don't view Putin's leadership highly and don't view the Ukraine war to be something that was justified, see Russia as a potential partner in a multipolar order and oppose isolating it. So the majority of people in South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya often vote against Russia's conduct and don't like Putin, but we still want to engage with Russia. And that has been quite successful. So again, it's been quite successful on the defensive side, this Russian disinformation, and not so offensive in terms of influencing public opinion on the offensive side. The subversion and the polarization spokes of Russia's disinformation strategy have been much more effective in Africa than they've been than the propaganda spoke. That's just an important thing to keep in mind here. The primary narratives that Russia has spread in Africa, even though it does have obviously customized ones for various country and regional contexts, have been three, and I want to kind of promote them over here. Number one, they want to promote the U.S. Hegemony and U.S. unilateralism and its proxies and extensions, namely France, because it's been so involved in security policy in Libya and the Sahel, as agents of destabilization and as agents of chaos. Whereas Russia as a force is promoting stability and order, the West, due to its reckless hegemony in the United States and neo-colonial aspirations of France, is promoting chaos and disorder. So they basically framed the 2011 intervention in Libya and the U.S. Subsequent withdrawal and lack of participation in the building of a new state, or at least what they see as a limited participation for the West in the construction of a new state, as the classic example. And the 2011 intervention in Libya, we look at Putin's recent speech at the Moscow Security Forum in August, was attributed to the unrest in Central African Republic. We said it goes as far all across the Sahel and also as far down as CAR. That's because of what the West did in Libya in 2011. Also, there's been a lot of conspiracies that have been floated in the Russian state media that the French are the actual, and the Americans are the actual financiers and promoters of terrorism. And they actually were involved in the creation and strengthening of Al-Qaeda and ISIS across West Africa, very similar to the narratives that they use in Afghanistan, where even the Russian foreign ministry itself at one point was saying these unmarked American planes were dropping aid onto ISIS-K strongholds in Afghanistan. Therefore, the U.S. created ISIS in Afghanistan. So they took the same narrative there, and they're applying it towards African context now. So the West is this agent of chaos, and we are the agent of order. We went into Syria, for example, and we helped Assad defeat terrorism. That's what they say. So we can maybe do that in other African countries, and that's something that's appealing to aspiring autocrats or autocrats in places like Mali, CAR. Now we will work with existing state structures and will help bring stability, whereas the West will try to democratize you, try to change your government, and promote chaos if it doesn't succeed. So, okay, then there's Western neocolonialism, framing the West as promoting it, and also Russia's efforts as successor to the Soviet Union's national liberation movements. So that's and another important thing, framing Western counterterrorism campaigns is largely extractive. And then the third is African agency, right? Promoting Africa, having a role within the multipolar order, and backing African solutions to African problems, and also encouraging an African Security Council seat. And there's really 4 steps in which Russia engages in this inside Africa. So there is priming. They kind of promote a variety of anti-Western narratives over a period of time, the resident narratives. The second is coalition building. They place multiple bets inside civil society and amongst the liberal actors who might be willing to cooperate with them. The third is a pragmatic alignment that would exist with one partner and lean towards that. And the fourth is attempted state capture, basically trying to become the guarantor of the allies' political survival, undermine the external partnerships of that country, especially looking at Western actors, and then using those political ties to engage in kleptocracy and to advance the interests of Russian companies and individuals like Prigozhin. So there's priming, coalition building, pragmatic alignment, and attempted state capture. Those are the 4 categories. And I've got 2 case studies which I was going to run through in Libya and Mali, but I guess we don't have time. So we can go for a couple of minutes. Sure. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So the first case study, I brought it basically over here. Each of them has got 4 slides, 4 spokes. So for one for each step. So the Russian disinformation warfare in Libya began in 2011. It focused on kind of lionizing and creating an illusion of authoritarian stability and prosperity under the regime of Gaddafi, and also attributing the NATO intervention to all of the ills that followed, and neglecting the role of regional powers like the UAE and Egypt and others in kind of promoting authoritarianism in eastern Libya, and Russia's own role, of course, in supporting Khalifa Haftar. Initially, the Russian information warfare was largely nonpartisan. They were kind of engaging with authorities in Tripoli, engaging with authorities in Tobruk. They were even suspicious of Khalifa Haftar because of his American citizenship and because of his close ties to France. But they kind of were trying to establish links with whichever groups that they could. And ultimately, they found the links in the East were stronger than anything they could create in the West. So they forged a partnership with Haftar. They saw him as a pliable autocrat and an opponent of grassroots Islamism. And they thought that Haftar could be a little bit like Assad was in Syria, somebody that they could work with and somebody that they could promote. But they never truly were 100% behind him, because Prigozhin was also running a parallel campaign to strengthen Saif Gaddafi's bid for the presidency. And then the Russian the disinformation machinery built on what we were seeing from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which are presenting the exact same thing, that Turkey and the influence of Western Libya was promoting Islamic extremism, whereas Haftar was kind of this counterterrorism actor. And they used state media and on-the-ground political technologists to strengthen their narratives and to guarantee a position of primacy inside Eastern Libya, and it's largely worked. Those 2,000 PMCs are there. Those PMCs are so powerful that even in Eastern Libyan bases, they determine who can come in and who can come out, not the Libyan authorities. And also, Russia's got control over 3 of the biggest oil ports in that region. And according to U.S. assessments, they're still shuttling back and forth in the hopes of creating a naval base there. So as you can see, they talked about narratives of authoritarian instability and opposing NATO intervention. They engaged in this kind of big, multiple events, kind of coalition building. They lent to one side with Haftar, and then they used that partnership as a gateway towards state capture. And we see exactly the same kind of thing happening in Mali, right? Talking about how France is plundering uranium and French and Western interventions in Libya caused the problem. Then trying to find various allies in the Malian military and Malian civil society, including hosting protests with some Malian figures who praise the intervention in Syria as something good. We want to see what happened in Syria happen here, because Assad crushed ISIS and we have ISIS to crush. And then they lead towards the Sini Goita, and then they try to capture the state, but they haven't really succeeded because they haven't been able to guard the gold mines very effectively. And now Mali's neither here nor there. They're isolated from the West. They're sharing bases with Russia, but they have a very powerless security situation. And the Russians have been unable to really secure their own objectives, in part because the ammunition or artillery that the Russians would need has got to be diverted to Ukraine, and all the infighting between Prigozhin and Putin and Prigozhin and the defense ministry really crippled their response. So Mali was less successful than Libya, but it's an example of how they use the same tactics. And the key thing for Western powers is to stop Russian disinformation when it's at phase 1, and not wait till it's at phase 4 to start paying attention to the problem. And unfortunately, we've seen our practitioners only start talking about this issue when phase 3 and phase 4 are in action, and not looking at it when phase 1 is happening by trying to counter it or trying to come up with an alternative narrative. And finally, we should come up with a few forward-looking assessments. Number 1, I think that Prigozhin's death has caused shockwaves to Russia's disinformation machinery. It's changed the character, but it's not going to change the strategy. That's really important. Russian social media campaigns are also getting more effective at evading censorship. They're no longer reliant just on troll farms and bot farms. They're actually reliant a lot more on local proxies and surrogates. So when it comes to the policies of companies like Meta or X, it becomes an issue of censoring freedom of speech, rather than censoring, automated content that's in violation of your terms of service. So they are getting more effective there. We should also watch for the fact that other countries are creating multipliers of Russian disinformation in the information environment. Countries like China in particular, but also, as we've seen in Libya, the Saudis and the Emiratis promoting very similar narratives to what the Russians are, and Turkey also promoting many of the same kinds of anti-French narratives and narratives about French neocolonialism and kleptocracy in places like Mali and Niger. But the silver lining is that we've seen a gradual ebb in the appeal of Russian narratives about the Black Sea grain deal, and finally leaders, including Sisi, including the Kenyans, and many other media outlets finally speaking out about Russia's suspension of it and how it's impacting food insecurity, which shows that Russia's ability to polarize and divide the international system, even in this current context, even in the current divided geopolitical landscape of Africa, is limited. So in general, I think that Russia's personalities might be changing over here, but they've got some new clever tactics to rely on other countries to promote their messaging, and also they're improving their social media campaigns. But there is a clear ceiling also on just how popular and how far Russia's information campaigns can go, and their ability to promote Russia as a country has always struggled. The propaganda dimension has also struggled, and now we're seeing the early signs of struggle in the polarization dimension too, particularly with regards to food. So that's kind of my overarching assessment, and now I look forward to questions and comments from the audience.
Sure, yeah. So, the normal tradition for an academic discussant is to take up the rest of the time telling you how great my research is. But I'm going to forego that tradition for today because after such a sort of stimulating presentation, I'm sure there are plenty of questions from the audience. I've just been flashed a sign from Alan there to say we can stay here till about 3:15. I understand some people may have other commitments as well, so we do need to leave. That is fine. So we are going to eat up a little bit of the coffee time after this.
Okay, we'll make it up and we'll just we have a bit of a buffer at the end. So.
There's a never tell people that. Just good into that. Okay, so perhaps we can open it up and take 2 or 3 questions from the floor. We'll let Samuel come back on those. Sure. Wait, just up here at the back.
Thank you. It was great. I am curious about whether this disinformation is part of, obviously, already a part of Russian political culture, but how organized are those campaigns? Of course, there was this study of institution created, but after that, how organized are those campaigns? Is it any kind of centralized structure that creates policies and distributes it to different entities and organs, or is it at the departments of propaganda and disinformation in each one of different entities, departments, ministries, etc.? So how organized is that? Because it looks like very structured. So yeah. Thank you.
Question here, and then we'll then refer to the Samuel. Yep,
Thank you very much. Your framework was really insightful, but I wonder how you're defining disinformation. So, in your Libyan case study, you have, the Russians are promoting disinformation by focusing on stability under Gaddafi and the chaos which resulted from threatening the nation. But I wonder, does that narrative not have traction by virtue of being true?
Is there a column? No, that's a great question. And then we just about here at the front.
Hi, thanks very much. I was just wondering, I was very interested in what you were saying about the interest that the polls in Africa had shown that the public were quite supportive of some kind of partnership between Russia and their country. But at the same time, there is a skepticism around, there seems to be a skepticism around the reasons for Russia being there. And I'm just wondering, is there more of a narrative of support by the governments of those countries than by ordinary people, first of all? And then secondly, just in terms of West Africa, it seemed to have been particularly vulnerable to the chaos that Russia wants to create. I'm just wondering, do you have, can you look into a crystal ball and say what other parts of Africa might be vulnerable to the same kind of interest by Russia?
Okay, so we have sort of 3.5 excellent questions there. So the first is looking at to what extent this is organized. Is there a central bureau to which it's put through, or is it a bit more scattergun? The second, I'm going to summarize, well, what if it's true? We'll leave it at that. And then the final question is a 2-parter. One is there a sense that there's a split perhaps between elite level opinion in these countries and public opinion? And the other is beyond West Africa, where else are there vulnerabilities for Russia having this kind of inversion?
Exactly, yeah. So just to kind of get back to the centralization of decentralization. But I think that, during the early stages when Russia is promoting narratives and trying to lay the priming for their eventual political interference campaigns, and also their coalition building efforts. So they're placing multiple bets for various actors, various militant groups, various paramilitary, various civil society groups. That is quite decentralized, actually. In fact, just like there are a lot of entrepreneurs from state-owned companies who kind of come to Putin to try to say we should go into this country or that country. There's very similar kind of lone wolf technologists or people who used to be kind of aligned to Prigozhin's policy and now are probably more fragmented because Prigozhin's gone, who would be kind of promoting and building partnerships with different figures and then trying to pitch the foreign minister, the defense minister, people in the Kremlin to go, okay, which actor should we back? Which actor is more viable, more feasible? So in the early stages, I would say there's a lot of disinformation entrepreneurship, if you will, existing inside Russia, right? Basically, these people trying to forge different partnerships, spread different narratives, see what sticks, see who's compliant, see who might be willing to work with them and promote their messages, and then taking it back to the Kremlin so the officials in the Kremlin can make a deliberation and decision on which of these pitches that they get is the most convincing and focus their efforts on one or generally two or three different actors, and then eventually one. But by the time the Russians have already picked a horse, like by the time the Russians have picked somebody like Haftar, they picked Goida, or to some extent they picked Hemeti in Sudan to lean forward on, then the operations become a lot more centralized. And that's when that disinformation nexus kicks in between the Kremlin organizations, the state media, and the local political technologists. So by the time the state is already starting to parrot the disinformation narratives, and by the time the state in Africa is already trying to promote, at least indirectly, usually in a veiled indirect way, the agenda of one party, that's when things become a lot more centralized and there's a lot more control. There's never the same amount of control over Russian information operations in Africa as there would be in terms of Russian information operations in the post-Soviet space, especially places like Georgia and Ukraine. There's always a lot more room for bottom-up thinking, policy entrepreneurship, flexibility, and basically coming up with things on the fly and those kind of very tightly regulated contexts. But there is a greater degree of centralization as the process moves from step 1 and 2 to step 3 and 4. That's kind of why I just wanted to highlight and articulate. With respect to the truth idea, but Gaddafi, there definitely is an argument, right? There definitely is an argument that Libya's standard of living, at least in terms of GDP per capita, was better. The stability and economic performance, by some indicators, was better. The West changed the regime in Libya and didn't really know or didn't really think that much about what was going to come after, just assuming and hoping that whoever would come after would not be as bad. Right? It was the same mistake that they already had in Iraq, and they should have learned it by now, but it happened again. So certainly there's some elements to it, but I think that it is to some degree distorted and and weaponized by the Russians. For example, extending the situation in Libya to basically be the sole explainer of all the chaos that we're seeing inside the Sahel, in particular between local militias in the north and the south, and some of the religious extremist movements that we've seen develop there, is quite misleading. Also tying it to even places as far afield as CAR is or Sudan, neglecting the local context is really an over-exaggeration of that's the weaponization of the narrative. That's why I kind of would put some of their arguments on this in disinformation, and not least because of which Gaddafi and his regime were not particularly liked by the Russians when Gaddafi was alive and Gaddafi was in power, right? They admired him to some extent during the early Soviet era simply because he paid for Russian arms on credit, and he actually always kept to his loan bills. He seemed erratic in so many other ways, but in terms of paying for things, he was quite reliable as a provider of foreign currency because he had money. But they never liked the fact that he was trying to interfere in so many other different countries, causing instability in places like Egypt, where the Soviets were working with. And some of his visions of Pan-Arabism and Pan-Africanism were very different from how the Soviets would have promoted those similar kinds of views, because it was more about continental integration and less about the promotion of socialism. And that carried forward right up until his death, when people thought that in 2008, Gaddafi had promised Putin a naval base in Libya, and there was no real progress towards that. So it's very, very misleading when they actually were critical and they were very frustrated with somebody in life, and then they promote him as some kind of a model leader and as some kind of a anti-colonial hero 10 years after his death. That's kind of why I kind of promote that. With respect to whether these narratives reach we're talking about civil society versus governments, right? I think obviously military regimes and autocracies in Central and West Africa have obviously also relied on support from various compliant civil society organizations and also from the bottom, right? Like Tchiani's coup and consolidation of power that we just saw in Niger would not have been possible if it wasn't for the sustained popular mobilization in its favor, which drowned out the support, any kind of support from Bazoum that we saw, and also the promotion of these sentiments at a grassroots level. There are civil society organizations in Niger that have nothing to do with Russia that are very critical of how the French have not encouraged Sahel governments to engage more directly in diplomacy with extremist groups. Because if they weren't just focusing on a security focus, counterterrorism prism, and they weren't so focused on killing the leaders of these movements, and they were actually more focused on trying to engage with some of the more moderate elements inside them and reduce the extremists to the fringes, then maybe we may be able to have more successful states. And Russia talks about in very vague terms that we want a situation and a political settlement in these countries that brings all parties to the table. They love that expression, engaging with everyone, universal engagement. So that taps into the ideas of civil society movements that aren't wholly linked to the Kremlin. Like, and there's this thing it's called CDF, the Citoyen Français. That's one that was in Niger that really promoted this point of view. We heard so much about M62, but we neglected those other groups. So the point is, the Russian, obviously disinformation is aimed at promoting and winning loyalty of the elites and the military and security apparatuses that come around them. But they cannot do that without pandering to civil society and having support from the bottom too. In fact, much of Russia's disinformation efforts begin at the bottom and then kind of consolidate at the top once they have a chosen set of leadership in place. So it's very, very important to really monitor what they're doing in the civil society sphere. We tend to focus so much on the surface level meetings between people like Prigozhin and Putin and various African strongmen, how we neglect what's happening actually inside these countries. And that's something we should focus on more.
Okay, I think we have time for another couple of questions if someone wants to come into that. So we've got one at the front and then one up here at the back and then a second one at the front. So we take those three and we'll give you a chance to respond. And then I think we'll have to wrap up. So we'll start with yourself.
Okay, so thank you very much for the presentation. Quite grateful. My question will be about the classification of these narratives, especially for the third one. Can you please expand what you mean by African agency there? Because when I first did African solutions to the African problems quite makes sense to me.
Yeah.
You know, so could you please expand what you mean? So how this became a kind of disinformation narrative?
Okay, we've got another question here.
How would you contrast the Russian tactics with those employed by, say, Western powers that are trying to manipulate geopolitics? And then what comes to mind is maybe 50 years ago in Chile or something like that.
Okay, and then we have one more just down here.
Well, connected to John's question, actually. So, you know, it can read as U.S. disinformation, you know, with what happened in Iraq or Afghanistan, for example, or other superpowers, which I don't want to name here. But yes, so how is it different? The tactics all sound similar to me. It's just being the devil's advocate. So.
Okay, so really there's sort of two questions there. One is in classification of narratives for the African agency one. To what extent is that a false narrative? And then the second one, well, they're all happy, aren't they? And what's distinctive? What's distinctive about the Russian approach of why is it completely problematic?
Okay, so yeah, first of all, I think I'll combine in some ways two and three a little bit and talk about one first. But yeah, like with regards to African agency and African solutions to African problems, I mean, obviously that is exactly similar to what so many critics of American foreign policy, European foreign policy have urged. Also, in theory, it sounds extremely good. It really dovetails and appeals to Africans' desire to become a pole within a multipolar order that authoritarians like Robert Mugabe or Democrats like Nelson Mandela have had very similar language on this over the course of time. And it empowers, in theory, regional institutions inside African countries, like IGAD, like SADC, or, you know, obviously the African Union to lead peace initiatives and to lead development initiatives and to look towards African role models of governance and development rather than, you know, just looking towards either the West or China. So in theory, it's obviously something that's very positive and very constructive and something that would resonate a lot. But in practice, the way the Russians push this is quite misleading. For example, in the crisis in Sudan, for example, I mean, the Saudi Arabia and the US have engaged periodically with the African Union formats. Russia has not really done very much in any serious way to engage with African Union formats over there. The Russians in Libya did promote and did elevate Thabo Mbeki, the former South African president, and some of his supporters inside African regional institutions who urged against the regime change in 2011. But Russian diplomatic initiatives inside Libya, Russian initiatives in Libya in the more recent times have focused on using military force in support of Haftar, engaging with various regional powers, but not actually engaging with African institutions in any kind of substantive way. And we're seeing that also in Mali. We're seeing the Russians now actually finding themselves at odds with ECOWAS, at odds with the African Union by supporting these coups d'etats, and by, if not, I don't think they're instigating them, but by embracing them, by supporting them, they're clearly fighting against the norms that are promoted by African regional institutions. So on the one hand, this is a double standard. On the one hand, Russia talks about empowering African governance, empowering Africa as part of a multipolar world order, but it doesn't engage with African countries in any kind of way that's substantive or meaningful, unless it serves their broader foreign policy agenda. And also, they actually go against the norms and values that African Union and African regional institutions are promoting, especially with regards to the waves of coups that we're seeing in the region. That's why I see this kind of contradiction and why I think it's problematic. And then there's obviously some more, almost farcical, but kind of like, telltale signs too. When Russia talks about putting an African country in the UN Security Council, and then within months or maybe a year or two of each other, they offer it to Egypt, they offer it to South Africa, they offer it to Nigeria, all at the same time in different negotiations, knowing that those countries have considerable rivalries in terms of their cases to be the leaders of Africa in international institutions like this. So they play different rivalries off each other to make it look like they're doing something. So that's kind of why I think in the Russian context, it's largely a disinformation constructed concept. With respect to what we're seeing, Russia and the West, and how it seems to be different from each other. Well, I mean, obviously, one can argue that, especially during the Cold War, right, the West was from using narratives about anti-communism that were quite similar to some of the narratives about anti-extremism that we see today, to justify supporting countries that had less than good human rights records or outright autocratic or even totalitarian systems, like we see with the Mobutu Sese Seko. So certainly, there are a lot of parallels that we can see between those. But in the current and in contemporary context, what I think is really most striking over here is the fact that Russia, whereas America and other Western countries typically, combine these kind of disinformations or manipulations, with various kinds of economic agreements, investments in education, development to some extent, and other things. The Russians are very thin in terms of what they can offer in terms of kind of economic resources or economic partnerships or potential, but they can sell their narratives a lot better than they can sell any kind of product. And that's kind of what's interesting over here. And the disinformation is not a tool to kind of promote a broader partnership with the country. It is often an end in itself. Disinformation is not just a tactic, it's actually a strategy. So that's kind of where I think we should, number one, I think draw the distinction. And number two, I think disinformation is often not necessarily aimed at creating or promoting any kind of political goal or steering a country towards its preferred direction. Like, for example, it's not like about aimed at democracy promotion, not aimed at even changing the regime. Sometimes it's just aimed nakedly at pursuing destabilization and fomenting unrest and sharpening ethnic cleavages, between external powers that are involved and people there, and then profiting off of the civil wars and the problems that come by striking mining deals with paramilitaries like Hemeti, or selling arms to both sides of a conflict at once, as we saw repeatedly in the wars between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and now arguably in Sudan's current civil war. So it's certainly Western countries use the same tactics, but the Russians are using disinformation, I think, not just as a tactic, but actually as a strategic goal of promoting instability and therefore kind of enriching themselves or creating discord and confusion across regions that leads to countries to continue engaging with them because they don't have other options and they don't want to isolate Russia. So that's kind of where I see the difference being. Like, disinformation is more of a strategy than just a tool.
Okay, it's 14 minutes past 3 at this point, so I think it's time to call time. And just to thank Samuel for a very insightful session and for a great Q&A. So thank you to the audience for your engagement as well.